Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever with Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And back with us again, Spike columnist Luke Gittos. Welcome.
Hello.
Coming up on today's show, we've got loads to discuss. We'll be talking about Britain's crazy judge-led asylum system, the shambles of the assisted dying bill, and the Labour WhatsApp affair. But before we get into that, Tom, we should talk about the 25th anniversary that's coming up, Spike's Big 25.
Absolutely. So we're celebrating our 25th anniversary, and as part of that, we're doing another big donation drive. So people who read our work, who watch our podcasts, who appreciate what we do, please do dig deep for that. We've also got a special offer on at the moment to mark this anniversary, which is that anyone who isn't currently a Spike supporter, a member of our online donor community, where you get to come to exclusive events and comment on the articles, read the website ad-free, can get a year's membership to Spike supporters for £25 for the 25th anniversary. That's half what you'd usually pay. So it's a great way to support our work and get loads of exclusive perks as well. I should say also that if you're already a Spike supporter and you want to benefit from this deal, if you go to spiked-online.com/donate and donate your £25, you can extend your membership by a year. So you can still enjoy that half price discount. So yes, go to spiked-online.com/donate, donate £25 or more and keep us around for at least another 25 years.
Cheers, Tom. That's spiked-online.com/donate. So we learnt this week about a completely insane asylum case. A judge has essentially opened up, it seems, effectively the Ukrainian resettlement scheme for refugees in that war to Palestinians. Now, this hinges on Article 8 of the ECHR, the right to a family life. It's just one of the many sort of crazy asylum stories that we're going to be discussing. But Luke, do you want to explain this particular story? Why is it that now it seems that Gazans will suddenly have the right to come to the UK?
So I tried to digest this judgment today. It's a judgment of the Upper Immigration Tribunal, where basically if an asylum claim is rejected by the Home Office, the applicant can apply and appeal that decision to a tribunal. And it's a judgment given by a judge of the Immigration Tribunal that is 15,000 words long. Extremely difficult to find your way through it. The essential facts are these. There is a family from Gaza who had connections to Fatah, who are opponents of Hamas, and they had a brother of the family in this country, but the Gazan contingent of the family hadn't seen that brother for about 17 years.
Yeah.
They had their claim for asylum rejected by the Home Office. They'd mounted part of their claim on human rights grounds on the basis that they have a right to family life and that family life includes perhaps long departed or long lost contacts abroad. And that therefore they had a right to settle in this country. Now, it's not quite right to say that this judge alone has sort of opened the floodgates or opened the Ukrainian scheme to Gazans. It's probably more accurate to say that the judge found that the mere fact that there wasn't a Gazan settlement scheme should not preclude this particular family from making a human rights-based claim. Now, that's kind of legal nicety, and I think really we need to focus on the outcome here and talk about how this judgment shows the complete mess that our laws are in, because no judgment involving the borders of this country should be 15,000 words long and so mired in legal complication. That what the European Convention on Human Rights has done, sadly, is introduce huge amounts of complexity, law, case law, into the decisions around who does and who doesn't get to come into this country and claim asylum. And that needs to be dealt with. Now, Kemi Badenoch tried to score some political points on this during Prime Minister's questions this week. She put the question to Keir Starmer saying, will you challenge this decision? Will you try and reverse this decision? Keir Starmer then came back and said, well, this was a decision taken under the previous government. And there is this kind of back and forth between Labour and Tories as to who is going to resolve this. The key point is that some political party needs to get to grips with the absolute maze of law in this area. That has to start by peeling back our obligations to the European Court of Human Rights. And then it needs to carry on by looking at the Refugee Convention, the law that is developed in the second part of the 21st century to the second part of the 20th century, earliest part of the 21st century, to deal with this issue. What I think a lot of people don't realise is that so much of this law is quite new, and it has developed very, very quickly, but it hasn't developed to keep a pace with the issues around mass migration. So it hasn't developed to deal with a world where people are a lot more free to move around. And so now we have this really strange situation where time after time we get decisions from the immigration tribunal that seem totally nuts. And I think the reason for that is that all of our law is now so unfit for purpose that people can make these highly individualized claims. They can make claims based on their own individual circumstances.
Yeah.
And the entire context of their application comes to be ignored. And I think that's actually a real problem. I think if we can't differentiate between a family from the Ukraine who share a lot of our values, who clearly are a lower risk to society than people from somewhere like Gaza, which we should remember is ruled over by an Islamist organization who train people to hate the West, who have expressed violent intentions toward the West. If we can't, at a legal level, see the difference between those two situations, and if the law can't enforce a difference between those two situations, we're in real trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's worth thinking on about some of the things that Judge said. I mean, it did feel like a judicial power grab in the sense that he noted that, well, Parliament has created a scheme for Ukrainians. It's previously created a scheme for Hong Kongers, Afghans, Syrians in previous wars. But it hasn't specifically said it's not for Gazans. Therefore, there should be we can't take it that Parliament or the government doesn't want this. The Home Office even wrote a letter to the tribunal where it says we do not envisage creating a scheme for Gazans. And the judge said that this was ambiguous. So this feels like a sort of activist judge, almost like deliberately misinterpreting the kind of obvious will of Parliament and the Home Office and the elected government on this issue.
The judge may have a case to answer there, but I don't think the blame for this can be put at the foot of the judiciary. You are going to have activist judges. Judges are human beings. You know, they're going to make decisions in accordance sometimes with their sympathies, their political sympathies. And there's a limited amount that you can do to prevent that. What you can do at the parliamentary level is shape the law that affects the decisions that judges make. And it is perfectly within the will of the ability of Parliament to restrict the ability of judges to be activists. If that's a real concern, then the law should be changed to allow less activism in this area. But the starting point for that has to be a reckoning with the European Convention on Human Rights, because that obligation to consider and pay respect to the rights created at the European level does allow for increased activism. It does allow for judges to be more to interpret the law more broadly. And you've seen that in relation to Article 8. I mean, Lord Sumption identified Article 8 particularly as a right that has been massively overinterpreted and massively expanded in terms of what it means, to the point where now lots of things that members of the public would think are ridiculous have been used to justify a right to family life. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, we've seen some quite crazy examples of that in particular emerging this week.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think what you see throughout all of those examples is that these rulings are increasingly not just an affront to democracy and our ability and our elected representatives' ability and willingness, taking Luke's point about how they have left this kind of legal architecture intact, their willingness, their ability to decide who comes here and for what reasons. You don't need to cast aspersions on all Palestinians to recognise that there have been, across Europe since October the 7th, many Hamas-linked terror plots which have been foiled, for instance, particularly when you're dealing with an organisation like Hamas who make sure that they can kind of disappear into civilian populations. You make a virtue out of that. It's clearly an elevated security risk. The idea that it's something which politicians shouldn't bother themselves with is obviously ridiculous. And then when you look at some of the absolutely ridiculous cases that we've seen bubbling up in the news recently of everyone from an Albanian national who had his deportation blocked on the basis of the fact that his son was a particularly fussy eater. I mean, the thing that caught all the headlines' attention was that he didn't appreciate chicken nuggets that weren't made in the United Kingdom. But nevertheless, the idea that that should get in the way of deporting someone who was found with £500,000 of ill-gotten money on him clearly has a tenuous grounds on which to remain in the country to the first place. And there's these cases just seem to be legion at this point. There was also the case not too long ago of someone who was allowed to stay in the country because of despite the fact that he had exposed himself to women, he was a kind of habitual flasher. Because of the fact that if he was sent back to his native Afghanistan, his sexual proclivities, shall we say, could expose him to harm. I mean, this is absurd by any stretch of the imagination. The right to family life being invoked in cases where an individual, a foreign national who, again, by right should be deported, that even though they're a convicted paedophile, their right to a family life should trump their ability to stay here, even though they don't have unsupervised access to their own children as a consequence of their convictions. This strikes anyone as ridiculous.
Their own families. There was the Congolese man, I think he was, who abused his stepdaughter and her cousins, and was granted this right to a family life. I think.
And there was a refusal on the part of a lot of people in politics and commentary to digest these examples, to recognise that this is a problem and that it's one that's been enabled by our kind of human rights legal structure underpinned by the ECHR. People just start kind of looking into the middle distance and talking about the end of the Second World War and Winston Churchill as if flashers, Albanian crime lords and convicted terrorists were who the founders of our post-war human rights setup had in mind when they devised all of these different policies. It's obviously not the case, but I think often there is a refusal to recognise these particular problems for no other reason than it feels like a third rail and kind of unseemly in some respects to call into question any kind of legal framework, court, what have you, that has the phrase human rights in it.
Yeah.
Like that in and of itself puts you on a par with Putin's Russia if you go near any of that. I think we're getting to the point now where the public is sufficiently aware of what has been going on under the banner of human rights that dodge isn't really going to hold anymore.
Yeah, I mean, Luke, you will be accused of being a populist, an authoritarian, a fascist if you criticise human rights. On the other end, you have someone like Lord Hermer, the Keir Starmer's Attorney General, who says that the ECHR and what it embodies is essentially civilization itself. And he said that this government will never challenge any ECHR rulings, as if they're sort of the word of God almost.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to forget that so much of what is included in the European Convention came from the English common law. I mean, it was English lawyers who were a huge part of crafting the European Convention. And it was, our human rights culture and our human rights law that gave the inspiration for that convention. And you're right. I mean, there has always been this idea floated around when we have the debate around repeal that people seriously say if we leave the European Convention, we will return to we run the risk of being 1930s Germany. You hear that all 1930s Germany is like we're 1 inch away, and the only thing keeping us is the European Convention on Human Rights. And I do think it's always been completely misleading because many of the rights that are protected under the European Convention are contained in our previous common law, as I said previously, but also the role that the European Convention has come to play is so hugely inflated in the minds of our elites that they can't admit to themselves that actually leaving the European Convention on Human Rights would not be dramatic. It wouldn't be catastrophic. It would just make particular political problems easier to deal with. One of them is migration. They seem to really struggle with the idea that if you make law simpler, things could work a lot better. And I think it speaks to this kind of reliance on the law to constantly be there in so many areas of our political life. I think we've become a lot more used to judges being a far greater part of public life now than we were maybe 50 or 60 years ago. We now seem to assume that without a judge getting in the way of something's going to go wrong, when actually judges in the past didn't play that role. They had a much more narrow role in dealing with very specific disputes. Now we sort of expect them to be everywhere and doing everything. And I think that's part of a problem with our political culture.
Definitely. Yeah, Tom, before we move on, I mean, we do have judges ruling on whether you can, build an airport, whether you can drill for oil, how high you can set your wages if you're a supermarket or, things like that. Adjudicating on Brexit and massive, political questions like that. Do we not just need to put the judiciary back in its box?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think you could look at something like this Gazan ruling and not see that this isn't a simple case of just calmly looking at and examining the law as it is and upholding the rule of law in that sense. There's been sufficient sort of latitude which has been granted to judges to interpret policy to the point where I think you could fairly say in some cases they're essentially kind of making up policy as it reflects in particular cases. This isn't necessarily across the board in all instances, but this is clearly a problem if you want to live in a democratic society. But I think it is important to go back to the point Luke made at the beginning, which is that politicians have allowed this to continue because it's a difficult, thorny issue, because of the fact that they've often thought that there will be some kind of neat way around it, or they could just try their best to win the various court cases they're expected to win to get a particular policy over the line. It's gone far beyond that point where that's an acceptable approach anymore. And I think you can easily get into a situation where just, in a sense, politicians can continue to kind of hide behind this judicial sort of morass which has been created rather than tackle it. They can just sort of gesticulate at an activist judiciary rather than take the steps necessary to ensure that even if a judge does want to act as an activist, they would be much more hemmed in doing so. But like so many of the problems that confront us, they're quite knotty, they're quite complicated. They require a level of political will and focus that a lot of politicians just don't seem to have these days, and they would rather just kind of fight their way throughout the next kind of 24-hour news cycle than tackle these much more fundamental and by definition kind of controversial problems.
This episode of the Spike Podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Have you ever dreamed of owning your own business? Well, in 2025, realizing that dream is easier than ever. And it's thanks to something that sounds like this. That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one e-commerce platform that's launching millions of new businesses around the world. Whether you're selling football shirts or vintage skirts, Shopify is the perfect tool for starting and growing your business in the digital age. Shopify really is the best way to take your first step on your business journey. It takes care of all the complicated stuff, so no need to worry about setting up shop on TikTok, Facebook or Instagram, because Shopify has got you covered. The great thing about Shopify is that it understands how important it is to keep things simple. As a business owner, you've already got enough stuff to worry about, which is why Shopify has built-in tools that help you create, execute, and analyze your online campaigns, so you can stay on top of marketing without any fuss. One of the best things about Shopify is its easy-to-use central dashboard. This means you can manage everything from orders to shipping to payments, anytime, anywhere in the world. So what are you waiting for? Your brand new business could be just a few clicks away. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Let's talk about the assisted dying bill. Kim Leadbeater's bill is still going through Parliament. It's been through the committee stage. It's currently being amended. One of the big news items this week is that the requirement to have a High Court judge sign off on the permission for an assisted death is quietly being dropped and being replaced with an expert panel. I thought what was interesting about this is that Leadbeater is calling this Judge Plus, even though it's actually removing the role of a judge. Now, obviously, we don't think so highly of the role of judges, but it is something that swayed a lot of MPs into backing the bill on its second reading. It was what made a lot of MPs think that it would have proper safeguards to prevent people from being coerced, for instance, into an assisted suicide when they shouldn't be. So, Luke, what do you make of this change and what it says about this process?
I think it was always a completely unrealistic safeguard to begin with.
Yeah.
I think everyone who looked at it said, how is a High Court judge going to process and deal with these incredibly difficult questions at the scale that will be required, on the time scale that will be required? So you have this requirement that someone has got 6 months left to live, and anyone who knows anything about the High Court knows it takes twice as long to get a case resolved.
Yeah.
So I had a hypothetical example at the time, which was, imagine if an application comes before the High Court, and the argument on one side is this person is perfectly fit to make this decision and fulfills the medical criteria, but there is concern in the judge's mind that they're actually being coerced. Let's take that hypothetical example. Well, one, coercing someone to commit suicide or to have assisted dying is a criminal offence.
Yeah.
And would be a criminal offence under the Leadbeater Bill. And that was another purported safeguard. So does the judge say, go away, I need to investigate the possible criminal offence that's happening right in front of my eyes? Does he does he have power to make his own inquiries? Does he refer the matter to the police? Whatever he does, it's going to take a lot longer than 6 months.
Yeah.
So anyone with any experience of how these courts work saw this was never going to happen. And so what's happened is that the panel is now taking place, this creepy panel that's going to be populated by 3 people who probably have their own sympathy with the prospect of assisted dying. In other words, you're going to have a panel full of people that broadly probably agree, because why else would you sit on a panel to consider these cases if you didn't broadly have sympathy with it? And the same situation arises. How can you possibly hope that for this panel to give any kind of scrutiny to a detailed and complex moral question like this when the person has 6 months left to live?
Yeah.
And really what's going on is that the safeguards are just being dialed down and dialed down and dialed down, such that if this panel is seriously going to be if this is going to be part of the picture, the next stage is to make the panel's considerations more streamlined, to gloss over any potential issues. There is no hope that a panel like this could deal with the kind of complexities that these cases raise, and I think that's extremely worrying.
And Tom, I mean, people often warn about the slippery slope in relation to assisted dying. We've seen in places like Canada how quickly it expands the criteria, once it's been legalised. We're seeing the slippery slope before it's even been legalised.
No, absolutely. And I think it's because of the fact that there was a lot of overclaiming on the basis of this bill. It was always framed from the off as an argument about safeguards, effectively, which I think the pro-bill side of the argument maybe starting to realise was they weren't onto a winner with that. Partly because of the fact that many of the safeguards they were proposing, and it's worth stressing that this High Court judge part of it, even though it was always quite clearly impractical as much as anything else, was central to their claim that this would be the safest piece of assisted dying, to use the jargon, legislation in the world.
Yeah.
There's about 60 MPs who are pretty much on record as saying that was the one reason why they were willing to vote for it at the initial stage. And it's only got about a 55 MP majority, so these numbers are pretty significant. And yet it's been peeled away so quickly. I think some people are within their rights to wonder whether or not it was a fig leaf to begin with.
Yeah.
We're in a situation in which there's already vast questions being asked about the ability of, on the one hand, the health service to be able to dispense adequate care, let alone there being this whole new area of essentially death care being offered. Similarly, a lot of important concerns being raised about the fact that how can you even really have anything resembling a supposedly free choice about a state-assisted death in a situation where there isn't adequate end-of-life or hospice provision. And that's something which the bill has not dealt with adequately whatsoever. And then you've got the legal aspect. We're constantly talking about how clogged up and sclerotic our court system already is. The idea that you'd have this whole area which would be brought under its purview as well was always for the birds. So I think some people are within their rights to question whether or not the drafters of this bill maybe always saw this day coming. But I think we've made this point before, but I think that the focus on safeguards is revealing because of the fact that it's impossible to mitigate against the slippery slope. Everywhere this has been tried, pretty much, the supposed limits placed on the criteria for assisted dying have been loosened up pretty quickly. There's the Canada example where it's gone from a setup which more or less resembles what's being proposed here, 6 months to live, end of life being reasonably foreseeable, to a situation in which disabled veterans are applying for a stair lift and they get offered assisted suicide instead.
Yeah.
That's happened in the space of about 10 years, but even in Oregon, which is often held up by Kim Leadbeater as the kind of model, that's still a situation in which people who, for instance, suffering from anorexia have been able to access state-assisted death as a consequence. And Kim Leadbeater has been very cagey and unable to give a straight answer on the fact that as it's currently drafted, many people believe that is precisely what would also happen under this legislation, because someone's anorexia could be deemed so serious that it is essentially a form of terminal illness. So the focus on safeguard, I think, is revealing. It's kind of put them on the back foot in a way from the very beginning, but it also, I think, underlines the fact that you cannot make this process safe. It's the sort of thing where unless you have, nowhere has it been tried to the point where you can mitigate against these grim circumstances and individual cases arising, because of the fact that fundamentally it's not something that you, as soon as you cross that Rubicon, in which people can access this kind of thing, it's it's basically impossible to mitigate against concerns about coercion, people being in the right frame of mind, what have you, because nowhere has that been achieved so far.
And one of the things that's really struck me throughout this process is just how Orwellian some of the language is around it. I mean, we've had Kimberly Leadbeater calling it Judge Plus when she's talking about removing a judge. We've had one of the witnesses during the committee stage from New South Wales talked about how assisted suicide was actually a form of suicide prevention, because it meant that people were not, throwing themselves off bridges or hanging themselves or whatever it might be. Just completely bizarre, as if the end result isn't suicide. Also, there's a real touchiness with Leadbeater and other supporters of the bill around using that word suicide. Even though it's a bill that would amend the Suicide Act, people have been told off for that kind of thing. Look, do you think is it necessary almost to manipulate language in order to get this over the line? Because it is actually very creepy and very scary what is being proposed.
Yeah, I think the need to regulate language comes from the fact that people want to ignore that this bill would fundamentally change the relationship between the state and death and life. Doctors would go from protecting life at all costs to offering an alternative to that, and that is the fundamental philosophical change that would be brought about by this bill. So all the talk around, I think Tom's right, all the talk around safeguards, around judges, around the safety of the legislation, it ignores the biggest danger, which is the philosophical shift that underpins the whole movement. Once you change that relationship, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Vulnerable people will be made subject to this change. They will be the ones at the heart of this change. And I just go back to the question of how you could possibly, if you are serious about safeguards, how do you possibly expect a panel, a judge, or anyone to get to the bottom of what is behind the cases that come before them? Yeah. How do they find out what is going on in the quiet rooms of these families, in the hushed conversations between vulnerable people and their family? How can you get to the bottom of what is going on in a vulnerable person's mind? How do you get to the bottom of how that change affects the way people feel about their own lives?
Yeah.
All of these are changes that you can't control with safeguards, with law. And it's that kind of philosophical shift that is arguably the most dangerous element of the bill.
And even if you could somehow arrive at this utopia where every case could be investigated as vigorously as people might feel comfortable with, even if we're in a situation where hospice care and end-of-life care and palliative care, whatever you want to call it, is wonderfully provided, and that that's not necessarily it has to be a consideration in terms of costs or in terms of what people might experience in their kind of final few months of life. Take that out of the equation, you're still left with that fundamental problem, which is changing, as you say, Luke, the state's relationship with death, the fact that it would create these kind of two categories of citizens, those whose suicide we try desperately to prevent, and this other group over here whose lives we deem to be sufficiently wretched that we should, if anything, facilitate their suicide and to aid it in taking place. And what that naturally kind of changes the state's relationship and society's relationship with disabled people, with vulnerable people, with elderly people. It also, in quite a concerning, sinister way, I think kind of changes our relationship with suicide as something that there should be so much focus on preventing, seen as something that people really do not want to happen, rather than something that is, as we say, facilitated. And in a strange kind of way, I think the only people who've been kind of consistent on this are the couple of Reform MPs who back both assisted dying in principle and the death penalty. That's two positions which I disagree with on both cases, but at least there's a consistency in that. But interestingly, even they have now said that they're not going to back this legislation because of the safeguards falling away. But always at the core of this was that principled debate, and I think it's been telling that through the discussion of safeguards, through the discussion of how complex the process is, and the constant appeals to expertise being a way in which you can mitigate against any potential downfalls from this legislation, has been a way that the pro-bill side have tried to evade that much more profound conversation, because I think once you have it, people start to realise what a sinister road that we'd be going down.
This episode of the Spiked podcast is also brought to you by Proton Mail. Now, we talk a lot on Spiked about standing up against big tech and for freedom of speech. To put my money where my mouth is, to put that into action, I've started using Proton Mail, which is the world's largest and most secure email server. Proton Mail isn't just about emails. It's about protecting your privacy and asserting your digital freedom. Using Proton means that every message I send is end-to-end encrypted. The only people who can read my emails or open my attachments are me and the person I'm sending them to. In a world where data breaches and online surveillance are unfortunately becoming more common, this kind of protection is essential to keeping your private conversations truly private. On top of encrypting all your emails, Proton Mail protects you from advertisers and tracking. Unlike most other email providers, Proton Mail doesn't scan your inbox to serve you ads or sell your data to marketers. It even blocks the invisible trackers that some companies hide in their promotional emails, so no one but you will know what you open, click, or read. Switching to Proton Mail is quick and straightforward. Their migration tools make it easy to bring your emails, calendars, and contacts with you. You can even set up custom domains or use the automatic forwarding tool to integrate Proton Mail with your existing email addresses seamlessly. If you're tired of worrying about your email security, then protect your messages with Proton Mail's end-to-end encryption today. Just go to proton.me/spikedpodcast or click the link in the description to sign up now, and you'll get a 38% discount. That's proton.me/spikedpodcast. So the Labour Health Minister has been sacked after his private WhatsApps were discovered. There's a big WhatsApp group full of other Labour bigwigs in his local area in Greater Manchester. Oliver Ryan, another Labour MP, has been suspended. 11 councillors have been suspended. Gwyn's texts are probably the spiciest and have caught the most attention. For instance, he wrote, imagining he was writing to a local pensioner, telling her to fuck your bins, I'm re-elected without your vote, and I hope you croak it before the all-outs, which are the local elections. Other texts include referring to a local council leader as Colin Cumface, made racist jokes about Diane Abbott, sexist jokes about Angela Rayner, quite possibly speculately made jokes about a man with a Jewish name, said that possibly he has links to Mossad. Tom, I mean, it's not pretty, but the reaction has been a bit over the top. In fact, people have called for him to be arrested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's been a couple of people who have reported him to the police, essentially, for hate crimes. And given how speech policing has been going in this country, I wouldn't count out him actually being convicted at some point, or at least that actually being properly investigated. I think the fundamental distinction we always have to make here is that there is an obvious difference between what anyone, including a politician who should know better, from what they say in private to what they say in public. And just because it's on WhatsApp doesn't make it any less private. I think everyone would say things in private which sometimes they not only wouldn't want to be made public, but also they probably don't really mean.
Yeah.
I mean, even some of the things that look the most discrediting, like this comment which is being presented as anti-Semitic, he's commenting on a gentleman whose first name was Marshall, and he said, oh, he sounds militaristic, and by dint of his surname, also potentially a member of Mossad. It's a kind of grim joke, but does it betray a deep-seated anti-Semitism rather than just a slightly dodgy sense of humour? It's probably the latter. And the fact that we're even finding ourselves having to kind of relitigate the contents of his particular jokes and humour suggests that we've left anything kind of reasonable and just moved towards a desire to just cancel this man at all costs. I think out of self-preservation, as much as anything else, we should avoid a standard whereby things that you might say without really thinking about it, when you assume that no one else apart from a handful of people you work with or are friends with are listening, if that becomes the means through which you can be not just cancelled but criminalised, pretty dangerous position for people to be in, particularly if they do use that app, which seems to enable this kind of knee-jerk, slightly outrage-seeking kind of posting under the assumption that it's going to remain private. But as we know, particularly if you're in your public life, it rarely ever does these days.
And look, the precedent for having people arrested, possibly jailed as well, sometimes for private WhatsApps or private Snapchats or various communications that people believed were private is quite scary, isn't it? I mean, it isn't unfeasible that Gwyn could be called before a judge at some point.
No, it's not. I mean, we've seen the precedent set in the case of the police. So we've had police officers arrested and charged and convicted for circulating racist abuse. And I know for a fact that police officers are told when they get given a phone that you have no privacy on your mobile phone because you are a public servant, and anything you put in a WhatsApp group is part of your conduct as a public official, believe it or not. I think, I remember speaking on this podcast when we were talking about the COVID inquiry. Yeah. That was all fixated on WhatsApps and the sending. And we talked about how this was a new age of transparency where politicians probably couldn't assume that anything they put on WhatsApp about their own decision making was likely to be kept private. So I think there is an issue here where I can't quite imagine what Andrew Gwynn was thinking in circulating, because this isn't a private. My understanding is that this wasn't a strictly private friends only WhatsApp group. This was had quite a wide remit, and it was professional. It was connected to his business as an MP.
Yeah.
So this isn't just him circulating gags with some friends. I do think what an extraordinary error of judgment, and it almost beggars belief that he would write these things on a group that contains political affiliates and is arguably connected to his public role. Having said all of that, I do think there is something about WhatsApp which makes people tell awful jokes. Because it's sort of like, it feels unaccountable. It feels very casual. It feels very offhand. And you do forget that the people that you are sending them to, not speaking directly from personal experience.
To be clear.
Although, I wouldn't want my best friends' WhatsApp groups to be leaked to the public, because, you do say things in that context which you presume are shielded from public scrutiny. But that's because you're doing it with friends in a context which you do assume is protected. If any of my friends are listening, you know who you are. So I think there is this difficult gap with Andrew Gwynn where, this was an arguably a more public forum than he should have been engaging with in this way. It does speak to a massive error of judgment. But I'd also think that, Tom, what the points that Tom made about the kind of nature of WhatsApp and the kind of dialogue it encourages does not necessarily belie his underlying discrimination against anyone. It's more WhatsApp brings this out of people, I think.
Definitely. Before we finish, I want to talk about the very public thoughts of Gwynn's replacement. Ashley Dalton, the new Minister for Public Health. She is a bit of a trans activist, I think it's fair to say. She was tweeting, these go way back to 2016, her tweets about this, but someone asked her, what should we do if someone identifies as a llama? Should we take them seriously? How seriously should we take that? And she said, yes, we should take it seriously. And those people should be treated with respect and dignity. Tom, what do you make of that? She's fallen so far down the trans rabbit hole. She cannot see a problem with even identifying across species.
That it really does take the biscuit, doesn't it? It makes you think that they're just not helping their own cause whatsoever. If you were a kind of committed gender ideology person, you'd think from day one, don't get drawn on the can you identify as a llama, cat, barn, whatever it might be.
Attack helicopter.
And yet they find themselves doing this time and again. Labour MPs of particular form. On top of the llama comment, obviously we have Dawn Butler, who famously said on television, I believe, that even babies aren't born with biological sex. We've had David Lammy not that long ago thinking out loud on LBC and coming to the conclusion that under the right medical conditions, a biological male can develop and kind of grow a cervix. In a sense, I don't think this is because they're being indoctrinated and being schooled in the ins and outs of gender ideology. They're kind of just having to make it up on the They've convinced themselves that they have to be kind of on the side of the supposedly liberatory approach to one's identity and so on. And so you throw any question at them and they just have to go with it. Whether or not they realise what they're saying is ridiculous or not. I think it speaks, if anything, to actually not so much that these people are committed trans activists per se, but how unthinking the embrace of this line of thinking has been amongst a lot of Labour MPs, members of the great and good, to the point where they can get caught out on what are obviously ridiculous questions. In this case, it was obviously a wind-up question in particular. They kind of forced themselves to take it to its logical endpoint. Yeah. But it's not even out of as I say, like a deep understanding and belief and study of the kind of yawning, absurd gender ideology literature. They've just kind of half thought about it and want to look like a nice person. Yeah. And so they end up saying ridiculous things.
Yeah, because I doubt Judith Butler would approve of identifying as an animal or approve of the comparison of identifying as an animal and identifying across genders. Luke, they just want to be kind, and if it would be unkind to suggest that it's a daft thing to do to want to identify as an animal.
Yeah, I think there's been some hysterical reaction to this tweet. This was sent in 2016, as Tom indicated, a kind of response to a goading question. So I think arguably you could read it as She's trying to be philosophically consistent. She's responding to what is obviously a ridiculous question. And I think over the past couple of days, we've seen these comments presented as though they're going to form part of her health policy, which is equally ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, she's not seriously suggesting any massive policy changes to accommodate llamas within the NHS, for example. I think that, but Tom's right. In a sense, these issues come up because the philosophical commitments that this position demands of people are often too far, a step too far. You know, we can't have blind self-identification. There are biological realities underpinning a lot of these questions. My feeling is that some of the crazier ends of this debate are now coming to an end, and that people are recognizing, for largely thanks to a lot of the important work that gender-critical feminists have done, a lot of the people in the gender-critical space, we now have a better, we are more willing to draw those lines, I think, as a society than we once were.
Yeah.
So hopefully, we won't be recognizing blindly and accepting when people identify as llamas. I don't ever think that was really the issue. The issue was, can we accept biological reality as part of our discussion around gender? And hopefully as a society we've moved more towards the sensible side than the ridiculous one.
You do almost feel for Keir Starmer though, because of the weird moment that a lot of Labour MPs had with this issue, he's probably struggled to fill that position. Someone who hadn't said something crackers about this issue at one point or another.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.